Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. This time, we're taking on a pretty huge topic, the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm.
It's a massive subject, but you've sent over some really interesting academic papers and some historical accounts.
Yeah.
So we're going to zero in on the impact on workers and how this whole thing really rewrote the rules of the economy,
Oh.
and get ready for some serious aha moments, because we're going to connect the dots, show how this era is still shaping your life today. Pretty cool, huh?
It really is. I mean, it never ceases to amaze me how these things from centuries ago can feel so relevant today.
Right. Sometimes history feels way more important than the news.
Totally.
Okay, so to really get this whole Industrial Revolution, we got to rewind a bit.
Okay.
Back to the Agricultural Revolution. It might seem like a detour, but trust me.
Okay.
This is where the seeds were planted, way back in the 16th, 17th centuries.
Okay.
One thing that really jumped out from the sources is this whole enclosure movement thing. Landowners in Britain, they started fencing off all this common land, literally building walls to control the crops and livestock. It's talk about a power move.
Yeah, a total shift in the whole idea of land,
Exactly. It went from a more communal system to one all about private property and profits.
Right.
And that's kind of setting the stage for the Industrial Revolution, right? That whole mindset shift from just getting by to let's make a surplus, let's profit.
Absolutely. It's this focus on maximizing output, on making a profit that's really going to be a driving force behind the whole Industrial Revolution.
Mm.
The question is, why Britain? Why did it all kick off there?
Yeah, good question. I mean, was there something in the water over there?
Not quite.
Huh?
But they did have a ton of coal, and that's about to become super important. But seriously, it was a perfect storm of factors,
Okay.
Britain had this stable government, strong property rights, thanks to those enclosures we were just talking about.
Right.
And their banking system, it was way ahead of its time. Plus, they were investing in things like roads and canals, which made it way easier to move stuff around.
Makes sense.
Oh, and here's something you might not expect. They were already using a system that was kind of I guess you could call it a pre-factory setup, especially for textiles.
You mean the putting out system?
Exactly.
Yeah, I was reading about that. It's where merchants would give raw materials to these families to spin or weave in their homes, right?
That's it. It wasn't a factory in the way we think of it today, but it's laying the groundwork. Workers making stuff for someone else's profit.
Wow. It's the OG freelance gig.
Right. Just, without the Wi-Fi and laptops.
I never thought about it that way. So textiles, that's a big deal here.
Huge.
Our sources say it was the first industry to get a serious makeover, Industrial Revolution style. What was it about textiles that made them, I don't know, so ripe for disruption?
Basically, demand. It was going through the roof.
Oh, yeah. Everyone wanted textiles, in Britain and all over.
But the old ways of making cloth just couldn't keep up. Think about if you're spinning one thread at a time, it's going to take you forever to make enough fabric for everyone, right?
Yeah, that makes sense. It'd be like trying to handwrite 1 million copies of a book. No wonder they needed a faster way.
Right.
And then boom, you've got these incredible inventions popping up. The spinning jenny, the water frame, talk about productivity on steroids.
Totally. The spinning jenny, that was mind-blowing. Instead of one spindle, suddenly you've got 16. And later, some had over 100.
Wow.
And the water frame, that made even stronger thread. But both of them still relied on human or animal power, And then comes this invention that changes everything, the steam engine.
Okay, here we go. It's the age of steam. Reading about this, I was struck by how the steam engine, it wasn't just about factories. This thing revolutionized transportation, too. Ships, trains, it's hard to picture our connected world without it.
No doubt. I mean, thanks to James Watt's improvements, the steam engine, it basically freed factories from having to be right next to a water source.
Right.
You can just set up shop anywhere you had coal.
Wow. I mean, we just take portable energy for granted today, but back then that was huge.
It was a game changer.
Yeah.
And it's amazing how much of our world today goes back to that one invention.
Totally. But this wasn't just about the machines, right? This whole thing created a whole new way of life. People, they were flocking to the cities for work, and this whole urban boom led to a whole new social order.
Right. It wasn't just tech. It was a total societal shift. Cities, they exploded in size, created this whole new urban culture that often clashed with like rural life.
Right.
And this new way of living and working, well, it created a new class system.
That's what's so interesting about history, the human side of all this.
Exactly.
So what did this new class system actually look like?
Well, at the bottom, you had the factory workers. They were the ones facing the toughest conditions, often exploited, not a lot of power. And then you had the artisans, skilled laborers who, because they had those specialized skills, still had a bit more bargaining power. Kind of like those weavers we were talking about, the ones in the putting out system. They hadn't been like totally swallowed up by the factory system yet.
That makes sense. So who's at the top of this new social pyramid?
Above them, you have the rising middle class, merchants, managers, professionals. They were generally the ones who benefited the most from industrialization, and they were the ones pushing for political change.
Okay.
And of course, you still had the old guard, the traditional elite, like the nobility.
Right.
They were trying to hold on to power in this rapidly changing world. And, you know, it's interesting how those class divisions, though different today, they still kind of echo in our society.
It's like the Industrial Revolution. It sent out these shock waves that we're still feeling today. But let's go back to those factory workers for a second. Our sources paint a pretty bleak picture of what life was like for them.
Yeah, it was harsh. There's no way around it. We're talking 18-hour work days, dangerous conditions, no worker protections to speak of. It was grim for a lot of people.
Oh.
And then there's this whole concept of de-skilling.
De-skilling? What's that?
Basically, the way work was organized in factories, it didn't need skilled labor as much anymore. Workers were doing these repetitive tasks, almost like cogs in a giant machine, easily replaceable. Took away a lot of the bargaining power that came with those specialized skills.
That's a really good point. So workers were basically losing their individuality and craftsmanship in the name of efficiency.
Kinda, yeah. And that loss of control over their work, over their lives, it led to a lot of discontent. And it's fascinating to look at primary sources from back then, like this worker-run newspaper called The Voice of Industry. It was from the mid-19th century. These first-hand accounts really give you the worker's perspective.
I bet. What kind of things were they writing about?
They talked about the loss of freedom, the feeling that profit was driving everything, the exploitation they faced from the factory owners. They felt like their lives were just dictated by the rhythm of the machines.
That's powerful stuff. So they weren't just sitting back and taking it.
Oh, no, not at all. The Voice of Industry also shows how these workers, how determined they were to improve their situation. They were advocating for shorter work days, better conditions, and more say in how their workplaces were run. It's a real testament to their resilience and, like, their fight for something better.
That's inspiring. Even facing such tough conditions, there were people imagining a different world and fighting for it. Makes you wonder, who are the thinkers, the reformers out there who are like championing these new ideas and criticizing the industrial system as a whole?
Well, that's a great question, and that's exactly where we're headed next. This whole revolution, it wasn't just machines and factories. It sparked a wave of social and political thought that is still shaping our world today.
It's amazing how the Industrial Revolution, it didn't just change technology, it sparked this whole new way of thinking about like society, economics, everything.
Yeah. It really did.
We were just talking about workers, right? So let's dive into, I don't know, some of the people who were really critiquing this whole industrial system, proposing, you know, different ways of organizing society.
Right.
One group that comes to mind is the socialists. What can you tell us about them?
Well, the socialists, they were some of the most outspoken critics of like industrialization's downsides.
Yeah.
They saw this growing gap between, you know, the haves and the have-nots.
Right.
And they were calling for a system that was more equitable, one that wasn't just benefiting the factory owners, you know.
Yeah, for sure.
Thinkers like Charles Fourier, he imagined these self-sufficient communities where everyone contributed based on their skills and like got what they needed in return. He even believed the toughest jobs should get paid the most. Pretty radical, even today.
Wow, yeah, that really challenges how we usually think about work and reward. Were there any actual attempts to put these socialist ideas into practice?
There were some pretty interesting experiments, actually. Robert Owen, another big socialist thinker, he set up model communities, like real ones, in Scotland and the U.S.
Really?
He really believed in treating workers well, offering education, decent living conditions. And his experiment at New Lanark in Scotland, it actually showed that this approach, it could be profitable.
Yeah.
It wasn't just some like lofty ideal. It was about proving that a more humane system could actually work.
So it challenges that whole idea that being fair to workers means you can't be economically successful.
Exactly.
That's a powerful message. And of course, we can't talk about critiques of capitalism without mentioning the big guy, Karl Marx.
Right.
It feels like his ideas are still debated today, even by people who've never actually read his work. What were his, core arguments?
Well, Marx, he's a complex figure, but his analysis of capitalism, it still holds up in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
He saw the system as inherently exploitative.
Yeah.
With the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital, profiting off the labor of the proletariat, the working class.
Right.
And he believed this would inevitably lead to conflict between the classes, and eventually, the workers would overthrow capitalism altogether.
So he was predicting a full-on revolution. It's interesting, though, that while a lot of communist revolutions drew inspiration from Marx, they often didn't really turn out the way he envisioned.
Yeah, that's true.
And capitalism, it's proven to be way more adaptable than he maybe anticipated.
For sure. But his critique of inequality and the power dynamics within capitalism, that still resonates with a lot of people.
Absolutely. His ideas, they're still sparking debate, shaping political movements, even today. But let's shift gears geographically for a minute. We've been talking a lot about Britain, but across the Atlantic, a similar transformation was happening.
Right.
How did the Industrial Revolution play out in the U.S.?
Oh, it's a great story, full of innovation, ambition, and, a little bit of borrowing from Europe, too.
Mm-hmm.
One key figure is Samuel Slater. He basically memorized the designs of British textile mills,
Wow.
brought that knowledge back to America, set up his own mills in Rhode Island, and boom, kicked off a textile boom in the U.S.
So he was like an early industrial spy.
You could see that.
So they had textiles, but what really set the U.S. apart on the world stage, industrially speaking?
Well, the U.S., it's huge, right? So efficient transportation, that was absolutely key.
Right.
And that's where Robert Fulton and his steamboat come in. That thing revolutionized travel and trade along the rivers and coastlines, connected this vast country in ways that just weren't possible before. It's like the American version of the railway boom in Britain, a total game changer.
Yeah, for sure. And then you have communication. Samuel Morse and the telegraph, suddenly information can zip across the country instantly. Hard to imagine our hyper-connected world without that.
It was a huge breakthrough.
It's like a highlight reel of American ingenuity.
It was. And remember those Lowell mills we talked about, the ones that offered young women work and a place to live?
Right.
They were part of this early phase of American industrialization, too.
Yeah, the idea was to give women opportunities while keeping labor costs down, right?
Exactly. But, even with good intentions, things can have unintended consequences.
That's true.
The Lowell mills, they did offer some women a degree of independence, but the reality was long hours, tough conditions.
Yeah.
And ultimately, they were mostly replaced by cheaper immigrant labor when they started demanding better pay and treatment.
Wow, that's a tough reality. It shows how economic forces can really shape social outcomes.
They do.
It highlights how complex progress can be. Speaking of complex, how did the Civil War, such a tragic period, how did that impact industrialization in the U.S.?
That's interesting because the Civil War, as devastating as it was, actually accelerated industrialization in the U.S.
Really?
Yeah, the need to produce weapons, uniforms, all those supplies on a massive scale. It led to new factories, new technologies, and a huge surge in production capacity.
Wow. So war, terrible as it is, can sometimes drive technological innovation.
Sadly, yes. It's a pattern you see throughout history. And after the war, a lot of those factories, they switched to producing consumer goods, which further fueled industrial growth. And this, combined with the expansion of railroads, ushered in the Gilded Age, a time of enormous wealth, but also, a lot of inequality and social unrest.
The Gilded Age. That's where those larger-than-life figures like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller enter the scene.
Exactly.
It's fascinating how they both built these huge industrial empires, but using really different approaches.
Very different.
Carnegie, the steel magnate, he was all about vertical integration.
Right, controlling every step of steel production, from the ore to the finished product, maximizing efficiency and profits.
And then you have Rockefeller and Standard Oil. He was known for being ruthless, crushing his competition, consolidating control over the oil industry.
It really makes you think about the ethics of it all, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you question, Competition, fairness, the role of government regulation, all of it.
Big question.
And let's not forget those inventors who kept reshaping everything. Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone, Thomas Edison with the light bulb, and all his other inventions.
So many.
It was this whirlwind of progress. But as you said before, there's a dark side to all this progress, all this wealth.
Yeah.
But what about the people doing the work, the ones making it all possible?
You're absolutely right. It's crucial to remember that for many workers, the Gilded Age meant terrible conditions, long hours, and always that fear of losing your job.
Yeah.
Some people did benefit, higher wages, new opportunities, but a lot of people struggled just to get by and faced a lot of exploitation.
So it was a time of huge progress, but also these profound social challenges. Like the Industrial Revolution was this double-edged sword, innovation and exploitation all mixed together.
It's a very apt description.
And amidst all this, a new force was emerging, the labor movement.
Yes. Workers weren't just going to stand by. They started organizing, demanding better treatment, a fairer share of the prosperity they were helping to create. That's when you see groups like the Knights of Labor, the American Federation of Labor, the Industrial Workers of the World, all rising up.
Powerful stuff.
They were fighting for shorter hours, safer conditions, an end to child labor, and a voice in the decisions that directly impacted their lives.
It sounds like a huge undertaking, going up against these powerful corporations and entrenched interests. Did they make any real progress?
It was an uphill battle, for sure. Progress came slowly, and it was hard fought. There are major strikes, the Great Railroad Strike, the Homestead Strike, the Pullman Strike, and often these were met with violence and pushback from employers and the government.
Wow. It's a reminder that social change, it rarely comes easy.
It doesn't. These strikes, they were turning points in American labor history. They forced the country to confront the issue of workers' rights and help pave the way for future reforms.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that the fight for economic justice, it's still going on. The echoes of those early struggles, they're still present in workplaces all over the world today.
It's amazing to think about how those early labor movements really set the stage for like so many of the worker protections we have today, you know, things we often take for granted.
It's true.
As we wrap up this deep dive into the Industrial Revolution, it feels like, wow, we've covered centuries of change in what, like an hour?
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
From the steam engine to the telegraph, bustling factories, the rise of labor unions, it's hard to overstate how much this era like completely reshaped the world. So as we kind of zoom out to the big picture here, what are some of the most, I don't know, lasting impacts of the Industrial Revolution? What should we, as like the inheritors of this whole complex history, what should we really understand about how it still shapes the world you live in today?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
How do we make sense of this massive shift and all its ripple effects? I mean, one of the most obvious and enduring legacies is urbanization.
Right.
Cities, they just exploded in size as people flocked to those industrial centers for work, creating all these challenges and opportunities that are still shaping urban life today.
It makes you wonder what it must have been like to, you know, actually live through that period of insane urban growth, the crowds, the noise, the constant change. It must have felt, I don't know, both exciting and kind of terrifying.
Oh, it definitely was a time of immense transformation. Those early cities, they were often chaotic, overcrowded, but they're also hubs for like innovation, creativity, social change. They forced people to rethink, you know, how to live and work together, how to design and build for these dense populations, and how to manage the complexities of city life.
Right, like the Industrial Revolution forced cities to adapt, to evolve, and alongside that whole urban transformation, you have this incredible surge in technology.
Yeah.
From the steam engine and the cotton gin to the telegraph and the telephone. These innovations, they didn't just change how things were made, they changed how people lived, communicated, connected with the world.
Totally. And it's impossible to imagine our world today without them. Think about it. The steam engine revolutionized transportation. The telegraph changed communication forever. And the factory system, it completely transformed the nature of work.
Right.
And those innovations, even though they came out of necessity, they set off this chain reaction of unintended consequences that we're still dealing with.
Yeah, like one invention led to the next, each one building on the last, and it just sped up the pace of change and pushed society in all these new, sometimes unexpected directions. And as we talked about before, these technological leaps, They went hand in hand with big changes in social structures, right? The old artisan trades declined, factories were on the rise, and you have this new class system emerging with factory owners and industrialists holding a lot of power, and this growing working class fighting for their share.
Exactly. And that tension, that relationship between capital and labor, that's something we're still grappling with today. The Industrial Revolution, it started this whole debate about the role of government, the ethics of capitalism, and the responsibility of society to, make sure wealth is distributed fairly. These are big questions that are still shaping political discussions and social movements all around the world.
It's like the Industrial Revolution. It didn't just change the world. It created this whole new set of questions, challenges that we're still trying to figure out. It makes you wonder, what will future historians say about our time, about all the technological and social changes happening now?
It's a fascinating question. Just like we look back at the Industrial Revolution with, a mix of awe and critique,
right.
Future generations, they'll probably see our era in a similar way, with both admiration and scrutiny.
Yeah, makes sense.
And who knows, maybe by looking at the successes and failures of the past, we can figure out how to navigate the challenges of today and create a future that's a little bit brighter, a little bit fairer, a little bit more sustainable.
That's a hopeful thought. And it speaks to the importance of understanding history, right? It's not just memorizing dates and names.
Right.
It's about understanding the forces that have shaped our world and then using that knowledge to make better choices about the future.
Couldn't agree more.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Industrial Revolution, what's the one big question, the thought-provoking nugget we should all be thinking about?
I think the most important question to ask yourself is, how do you see the echoes of the Industrial Revolution in your own life?
That's a good one.
How has it influenced the way you work, what you buy, how you think about progress and technology? By really thinking about those connections, we can better understand the present and make more informed choices about the future we want to create.
That's a great challenge, and one I hope our listeners will really take to heart. Because at the end of the day, the Industrial Revolution wasn't just a moment in time, it was the start of a process that's still going on, and we're all part of that story. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Industrial Revolution. We'll catch you next time for another exploration of the ideas that shape our world.